Hey, good evening. It's Thursday, September 1st, starting a new month. Thanks so much for being here tonight and for just being a part of Everyday Talk 24/7. It's great to have you here. As you know, this week I've been talking about Psalm 139. And these first set of verses 1 through 18, talk about this beautiful, in three sections, this beautiful, amazing, intimate connection that God has with us. He knows everything about us, the good and the bad, before we say it or think it. He's always with us. We can never run from His presence. And then, our identity flows from Him because He made us. We read two nights ago, you made all the delicate parts, inner parts of my body, and knit me together in my mother's womb. Everything about me has been wonderfully designed by God. Whether the world or the culture or somebody else thinks it's cool or not, God had a particular purpose in making that. And it's our obligation to find out what that is about each person. As I mentioned last night, we've become too busy for that. We'd rather categorize people rather than get to know them. So how does David respond to each of these just mind-blowing, intimate connections that we have with God? He knows everything about us. He's always with us. He even made us and knit us together to be exactly the way that we are. David's response to that just blows his mind. And he says, how precious are these thoughts to me? How precious are your thoughts? So we can't even count these thoughts that God has about us. It's just truly amazing, the complete love of God. But then we come to these troubling verses for us. Because now we switch from David being blown away by God and just how precious God is to him, all the great things God has accomplished for him. We switch to, are we going to be loyal to God? So in response to these wonderful things, David says, "Oh God, if you only would destroy the wicked. Get out of my life, you murderers. They blaspheme you. Your enemies misuse your name." That's what the commandment is talking about. "Oh Lord, shouldn't I hate those who hate you? Shouldn't I despise those who oppose you?" And then he says, "Yes, I hate them with total hatred. For your enemies are my enemies." See, he's talking about loyalty with God. Your enemies are my enemies. I cannot be close with someone who despises this person that's done all these things for me and has given his life for me and has made me the way that I am to honor him. I can't do that. Jesus says you can't have two masters. You're going to love the one or you're going to hate the other. You can't serve them both. You can't serve anything other than God without hating God. That's the window we want to have opened up for us here. This hatred that's being talked about here is going to be different for us than in David's time. Because David represented the kingdom of Israel. And the kingdom of Israel had an obligation to carry out God's vengeance on the enemies of God as they came across them. But now we're not talking about the kingdom of Israel anymore. Now, for us, we're talking about the kingdom of heaven. So how do we represent and stand for God and blow away those enemies of His? How does that work? Now, instead of us forming armies to take out retribution, we're trusting God to take out the retribution. It's not that it won't happen. We're just trusting God to do it. The principles are still holding. People will reap what they sow. We just have to trust God's faithfulness and God's timing. We can hate evil by doing things like returning good for evil. Huh? Yeah, that's what Romans is telling us. But even that is not passive, because it heaps burning coals on those who would be against us. We can bless those who curse us. We can represent God well. The point here is our loyalty is to God, not to man. And if God has commanded us to do certain things in response to evil, that's actually hating evil and turning to God. But there's still this issue. Sometimes we have to turn away from this evil. We can't be loyal to God and to people. We can't be gracious in the way people want us to be gracious. We have to be gracious the way God wants us to. So loyalty means that I turn away from those who hate the ways of God. I leave the retribution to God. I leave the heavy-duty lifting to God. But I must not walk in that way. See, you cannot separate the sin from the sinner. A lot of folks say that. But that's a myth. It's not what God's called us to. We'll see why in just a minute, how we're connected with that. But these people who would lead people astray, who would lead us away from the faithfulness of God, that's for real. We can't separate that out. God's the one that can take care of how it works out, but we can't try and start sorting that out, where we wind up being loyal to somebody. Well, I can separate a sin away, but I can still be loyal to this person. No, I can't do that. That's what David's saying here. And Jesus is going to give us some instruction in Matthew. Sometimes we do speak grace and peace, but other times, we are told not to cast our pearls before swine. The bottom line is loyalty. In Matthew 18, Jesus is speaking about this. He says, at that time the disciples came to him. So who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Again, the out-to-lunch disciples continue to ask these outrageous statements instead of understanding what Jesus has been teaching them. So Jesus called in response to them, he called a small child, had him stand among them. And he said, truly I tell you, unless you turn and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. They're talking about who's going to be the greatest. And Jesus says, no, you don't do that. You must have this humility of the little child. Therefore, whoever humbles himself like this child, this is the one who is greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Not your debates about who's good and who's not. We have to turn away from that. And so much of what's happening in the world around us today and the temptations we have and the enemies of God want us to think highly of ourselves. And when we think highly of ourselves in this way, we are disloyal to God. We're not hating evil. We're embracing it. But now notice these words. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to fall away, it would be better for him to have a heavy millstone hung around his neck, and he will be drowned in the depths of the sea. Woe to the world because of its offenses, for offenses will inevitably come. But woe to that person by whom those offenses come. See, Jesus isn't separating the sin from the sinner. It's not the sin that's being tossed into the sea with the millstone. It's the sinner. Our loyalty must be to God. We must reject those teachings which pull us away from God, which pulls our children away from God. And in humility and love, we must embrace God. And that's how we hate the enemies of God, by trusting him and not following those teachings, but having the courage to be loyal to God. I'm sure this might spur some questions. If you do, please, send them in the comment section or do it through the section on my website, Everyday Talk 24/7. There's a response there. These are important issues for us. We don't need to run away from what we're being taught in Psalm 139. We can hate the enemies of God by being loyal to God and loving and hating His way, not in the world's way, but what God's called us to. And that's the thought for this night. Love or hate, it's about loyalty. And Lord willing, we'll see you tomorrow. You have a great evening. Good night.